Good morning, everybody. Welcome to, it looks like a very nice day. We should wrap this up and enjoy the outside while we can. I've been working through your exams. I've been trying to, for those of you in the US politics, I'm trying to wrap those up, but I have gotten through a few of the exams for this class, about 10 or so, and some great responses from you. So some of you are going to be very happy. You'll get a bunch of feedback from me. So, it'll take me, ideally, I'd like to get them to you by the end of next week. So you'll have something to chew on. Yeah, that's kind of where all those sit for the time being. So I'm hopeful that get them to you next week and you'll have lots of good feedback. I don't think there's anything else, any other announcements. But look, I've got this cool whiteboard that I went out and bought. And the reason is because I want to talk a little bit about balance of payments today. I guess clean up a little bit of what we were saying the other day about fiat currencies for just a couple of minutes, because we kind of whipped through that, talking about the Wizard of Oz there at the very end. And the Wizard of Oz discussion is important for a variety of reasons, because not so much because I want you to become experts on the Wizard of Oz and the monetary allegories or anything like that, but more because just to sort of say to you that we have not always had paper currency the way we do now. Okay, it goes way back to when we used to walk around with little ingots of gold in our pockets. And one of the problems with those, of course, was that if you were an enterprising or maybe a thief, you would start to shave off the edges of those ingots of gold. And so after a while, the currency was kind of debased, right? People would sort of cheat and they'd shave off bits and pieces of currency that was actually physically in gold. And so we've had periods of time where things were anchored in precious metals, and we just traded precious metals. There's obviously barter economies where we trade jars of peanut butter, I guess, with each other. But one of the things that's important about fiat currencies is that they are paper. When you take out a $5 bill or something like that, and to the extent that those of us, we don't really even use paper money anymore. It's all electronic transactions. This is a very dynamic area of international political economy. And some of you may even be enterprising traders of Bitcoin, for example. Even though I don't know what it is, it's exorbitantly expensive. Like the Canadian dollar Bitcoin rate is, I think it's 14,000 US dollars per Bitcoin. It's ridiculous, right? But the point is that we do now have a kind of series of cryptocurrencies. Facebook is trying to come up with one. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but it's called it's a short name, but I forget what it is. Facebook's trying to come up with its own cryptocurrency. When we think about currencies and their value and why do we, why do we use them? Why do we accept them? Well, I have put together on my little whiteboard here a kind of basic outline. I hope you can all see this a little bit. But what are the functions of currency? And you can apply this to whether it's your paper money in your pocket, your loonies, or the Bitcoin. And the basic three qualities of a decent currency. And when you think about these, think about them in terms of your willingness to hold these currencies, whether in paper format, loonies jingling around in your pocket, versus another currency, say a Mexican peso, for example, or something that's cryptocurrency that you can't really even touch, right? It's an electronic form of payment. But nonetheless, they all have some of these similar qualities if they're going to be any good. And there have been a lot of challenges by economists about whether or not cryptocurrencies are kind of here to stay, and how valid or durable they are. So someone puts here the Libra. The Libra is the one that Facebook is trying to come up with. And if you decide you want to hold a cryptocurrency in your portfolio, or you want to use it for transactions of one kind or another, you might want to ask yourself whether you want to hold Bitcoin going forward, given maybe some of you know there's been a lot of problems with Bitcoin here and there where Bitcoin miners steal the Bitcoin out of people's account, and it's all very complicated. Or you want to maybe hold something like this Libra because it's backed by Mark Zuckerberg and you all trust Facebook at some level, right? And so these are really important questions. But when you think about fiat currency, paper currency, right, you want to think about these basic three qualities. A medium of exchange, okay? That's an important quality for any currency. Can it be used by you and I to exchange for the things we buy at the grocery store? Can we take it out of our wallets and offer it up, or as an electronic version of it with our credit cards, our debit cards, and so on? Can it be used as a medium of exchange? And well, how is that? There's a social convention connected to that, right? You and I, we sort of look at our dollars in our pockets and we say, well, this is going to buy us something somewhere. And so we're willing to leave it in our pockets for a while, okay? That comes to this notion of a store of value, all right? Meaning that if you hold the currency in your pocket for 5 or 6 days, it's not going to lose its value, or it's not going to be completely worthless at the end of that 5 or 6 days. So when you think about hyperinflation, for example, and governments, I sent you a piece about Argentina, governments turning on the printing press and really sort of debasing the currency. It's the equivalent of shaving the edges of a gold coin off, right? You're essentially watering down its value. Well, what's it doing if it doesn't hold value? Why would you hold it in your bank account? So currencies need to have a quality of it being a store of value. So if you put it in a savings account or put it away somewhere, you hold it in a kind of a dormant state, it's not going to lose all of its value, okay? And then the other one, the last one is it a good unit of account, all right? Can it be used in some sense to compare prices? So if you go to the grocery store and you see that a loaf of bread is, $3, $3.99, you're basing that on this kind of quality of a currency, denominated in dollars. There's a price, and you can compare the value of different commodities. And you can do that with different currencies, right? If you have two currencies in your pocket and you're looking at the same product, you can decide whether, what the value of that product is, whether it's, worth your money or not, right? So as a unit of account, a way to kind of benchmark your assessment of the value of something, okay? So these three basic qualities: medium of exchange, and that one I would argue is one of the more important ones. If you go to a lot of countries, the domestic currency, sometimes there's an entire underground economy, for example, and the domestic currency is not really, people don't have a lot of faith in it. And so there's an underground economy in dollars, for example, US dollars. But that notion of the medium of exchange, that willingness, and connected to store of value, but that willingness of you and I to exchange, your $5 bill is just as good as mine. I'm willing to accept $100 from you because I know that $100 will be good in a week. Those are important qualities of a currency, but you can imagine how the monetary authorities, or think this through in your own minds, imagine how the monetary authorities can get themselves in a bit of trouble if they start messing with these things, or messing with their currency in a way that mucks with these basic qualities. Then people run away from that currency and they want to hold alternatives. They want to exchange domestic currency for some other asset, whether it's a physical asset, for example, or say property or something like that. Sometimes people do that. They bury their money in property, hoping that the currency will come back at some point. But they may more often begin holding accounts or assets denominated in other currencies. And so a lot of you perhaps may have a US dollar bank account. Your parents may have a US dollar bank account. That's not necessarily an indictment of the qualities of the Canadian dollar, right? But it is a suggestion that there are, in a sense, kind of two economies operating. Why do you have a US dollar account? It's to immunize yourself from exchange rate fluctuation. So if you decide to go to Vegas and pull the slot machines, none of us are doing that now, but go to Vegas and pull the slot machines, instead of using your Canadian dollar account and getting hosed by BMO when you go to exchange for US dollars, you'll just have that US dollar account to kind of immunize yourself from any exchange rate fluctuation, right? But in countries where the domestic currency is in real trouble, you see this entire underground economy where you can freely exchange US dollars in exchange for goods rather than the domestic currency. Okay, so just to point that out, that we got all these different qualities of currency. We have these different regimes of currency. Paper money, some argue, may be supplanted by these cryptocurrencies. But ask yourself, when you decide to go out and get a Libra account, or decide to speculate on Bitcoin, whether it satisfies all of these qualities, these basic qualities of a good currency, and then you can decide for yourself whether you want to hold it. All right. Now that brings me to a slightly different issue, and that is at the bottom here. Hold this up, and that is Bretton Woods. Now we talk about Bretton Woods most of the time in terms of post-war institutions, IMF, World Bank. And the big meeting in 1944 to chart the post-war architecture, global economy, and so on. But one of the things that they did at Bretton Woods was come up with a system of fixed exchange rates among the large remaining economies. And so when you read monetary, say you read David Dodge's History of Canadian Monetary Policy. It's a paper, a speech that he gave here at the U of A. That's posted there to eClass. He talks about Bretton Woods mostly in terms of a fixed exchange rate regime, an agreement that was struck at Bretton Woods to fix all of the world's sort of remaining currencies, the US dollar, the pound, the franc, the Deutschmark, the lira, and so on and so forth, fix them to the US dollar. So they didn't float the way that we see fiat currencies float now. So often you'll see in the literature around monetary relations, they'll talk about Bretton Woods, or you hear even now sometimes discussion about having a Bretton Woods 2, meaning, hey, we should get together, a big international conference, and we should have a Bretton Woods 2. Well, what they're referring to is reverting back to a new system of fixed exchange rates among the world's major currencies to sort of limit some of the exchange rate volatility, the fluctuation, and the volatility that sometimes is caused in the global economy by changing exchange rate values, right? And so what the Bretton Woods exchange system of exchange rates did is peg all of the other currencies to $35 an ounce US dollars, 35 US dollars per ounce of gold. So in a sense, this fixed exchange rate system was a kind of gold standard. Everybody's currency, the value of its currency, was tied at some level to physical ingots of gold held in the national, the national treasury somewhere. And what they agreed to do was exchange their currencies at a rate connected to $35 an ounce. They arbitrarily set the price of gold at 35 US dollars per ounce. And on Friday, I think we'll talk about this on Friday, there's a problem that I want to talk with you about in terms of the problem with these fixed exchange rate regimes is that they inevitably fail. And there's a problem that's called the N-1 problem. The N-1 problem. And there's a whole series of notes that I'll walk through. But the N-1 problem is this problem that economists have identified with these fixed exchange rates. And what it basically means is that one of the countries in that system of fixed exchange rates becomes the default currency. I mean, nobody was really practically moving gold ingots around in order to maintain this relationship under Bretton Woods. And Bretton Woods collapsed in the early 70s. And we've got this system of floating rates that we all know about right now. But the reason is because of this N-1 problem. The US dollar became the de facto, what they call the de facto key currency. And it created huge imbalances for the others in terms of maintaining that system of fixed exchange rates. This happened also in Europe. And it also explains, and we'll talk about how George Soros, some of you may know George Soros from conspiracy fame. He's part of every conspiracy you can think of. But George Soros made his money speculating against the British pound in 1992, and he exploited this very problem. And so we'll talk a little bit about that probably Friday. But I just wanted to throw that at you right now because just to sort of put that on your radar in terms of understanding some of the financial crises that we're going to talk a little bit about, and that fixed exchange rate systems are kind of inevitably doomed, or they're very unstable, and they don't react very well to a series of external shocks. And that's what happened with Bretton Woods, and it's also what happened with George Soros speculating against the British pound in 1992. And there's a bunch of really good stuff posted on eClass that I'll highlight for you. They're easy reads, they're mostly histories, but they're really interesting in terms of trying to understand what Soros did and how he got really, it was the start of him developing a very bad reputation, and also becoming this kind of, this weird, he's like a weird cult figure. He's almost like Elvis Presley in the sense that he's always a part of every conspiracy theory. QAnon, you name it, he's part of it. And so it's it's a phenomenon that I don't quite understand. Any questions right now? And then I want to shift gears just a little bit for the balance of today, and talk a little bit about balance of payments. Not unconnected, but just wanted to throw these few little things at you. You'll find this stuff in any economics textbook, but I also just wanted to highlight that Bretton Woods was a system of fixed exchange rates that's different from the system of floating rates that most Western countries, developed countries, currently are under. But that system, that floating system, is a byproduct of this collapsing in the early 1970s. And so as you're reading and they talk about Bretton Woods, just be aware that this is what they're talking about in many cases, a system of fixed exchange rates. And when they talk about volatility, Bretton Woods 2 would be a big negotiation to bring most currencies back under a new system of fixed exchange rates that many people think would be better. I don't know that that's true, but just to be aware that that's part of some of the debate that's going on among economists. All right. Okay. So erase my whole thing. By the way, one of my favorite political commentators, a guy by the name of Tim Russert, used to work for NBC. If you go back and do YouTube of like the 2000 election, the night of the 2000 election, he had this little whiteboard, and he was better than any computer or any guy with a smart board like John King on CNN. He would do all his electoral college stuff right there on his little whiteboard. He's brilliant with it. Unfortunately, he died, so he's not with us anymore. But anyway, okay, I want to try and share some screen with you. Let's see here. Just give me 1 second. Okay, I'll show you where I'm going with this. All right, so this is, you're seeing eClass, I hope. Thumbs up, yes, eClass, okay. Just want to show you where I am. This is all under week number 4, international monetary theory. We've talked a little bit about the supply for, the demand for foreign exchange, a little bit of, fiscal and monetary policy, trying to understand how those things work, right? Talked a little bit about central bank, independence, depreciation and appreciation of currencies. Talked a little bit about that. We ended last time, focused a bit on, Wizard of Oz and trying to sort of shake up our thinking about what, monetary regimes are, and some of the challenges or some of the political arguments around whether or not, fixed exchange rates, say a gold standard, or monetizing it with paper or a different kind of precious metal. And so we've kind of finished that discussion just now. You can come back to it if you want. But what I want to do is try and throw at you So I'm going to click on the US balance of payments. All right. Now remember, I said a week or so ago, one way to begin thinking about debt and deficits. We had the US debt clock up there, and it was racking up all kinds of numbers. And we were looking at the different debt to GDP ratios of different countries. And we said that one of the things to be cautious with when you read that in the newspaper is there's a lot to unpack when you look at those raw numbers, right? Some of them are kind of sobering, but there's actually quite a bit to unpack when you think about a country's financial situation, right? And one way to sort of understand a country's balance sheet, I guess, is to think about your own personal finances. Now, it's more complicated than that, but that is the simplest cognitively to begin thinking about a nation's checkbook, much like your own checking account, okay? Where you have credits in and debits out, and a nation's transactions look very much the same. So if you go to this on eClass, and I'm only using the US one because Statistics Canada changed the way that they report or display Canada's international transactions, but it's exactly the same. And if you go to this comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the United States, a couple of years old now. But if you go to table number 1, US international transactions, you will see here some things that I've highlighted. When you think about a country's checkbook, okay, there are two parts to the ledger, right? There is what we call a current account and a capital account. I'll show this to you. A current account and a capital account. All right. So on this sheet here on eClass, you can see at the top you have the current account. Okay. And the first thing I've highlighted there is exports of goods and services. Okay. The second one is imports of goods and services. These are the transactions or the receipts and debits that the United States has as a country, the collectivity of all activity that the United States, that Americans engage in, right, on the current account, okay? And basically, the easiest way to think about this is that this is the trade balance, okay? And on this, you'll see over to the far right, if you follow with me, at the very top, exports of goods and services, you got, 836,000, okay? Imports of goods and services, 959, okay? That indicates a trade deficit for the United States, which intuitively, we know the United States is running a trade deficit all the time. I sent you that piece about China yesterday. That's quite interesting, just in terms of describing some of the dynamics between the United States and China, understanding the Sino-US economic relationship. But here you see that these are the transactions the United States has with the entire world on trade, okay? You can think of the current account as mostly about trade. There are other things, as you can see here listed, okay, but it's mostly about trade, okay? And you can see the US is running a trade deficit, meaning the United States, I'm sorry. Meaning the United States is importing more than it is exporting, okay? It is paying foreigners more for its imports than it is earning in terms of exports. So on this ledger here, it is earning, the difference between these two is roughly 123,000, okay? The United States in 2017, which is when this table is from, is importing roughly 127,000 or 123,000 millions, I think it is, more than it is earning. It's paying foreigners more for its imports, capital going out of the country, okay, than it is earning from its own exports, okay? So it has a current account, we say it has a current account deficit, okay? It is paying foreigners more for what it imports than it is earning in terms of foreigners paying Americans for what Americans export. Okay, somewhat clear? I'll go through this. We'll stop and I'll make sure we have an opportunity for questions. Okay, the difference there, by the way, is about 123. 123,000, just for a reference point, okay, if you add those up, right? Now, I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and I'm going to show you on the capital account, okay? That's over here, capital account. That should be okay. All right. This is essentially foreign investment, foreign capital flows in and out, money flowing in and out of the United States, okay? And what you see here is that the United States has capital flows in. Sideways. See, I would do this on like a big whiteboard in a classroom if we weren't in this, but I'll just write it down. So, all right. So the United States has greater capital flows into the country than out. And you see here that you have acquisition, U.S. acquisition, net U.S. acquisition of financial assets, about 350,000, okay? And then U.S. net incurrence of liabilities, okay? 472,000 and change, okay? Lo and behold, guess what? The difference is it's about 123 as well. Okay? What does this mean? What this means in the totality here is that in order for the United States to finance its consumption of imports, its excess consumption of imports relative to what it earns in exports, it needs to import capital. It needs to import capital. It needs to have a positive inflow, a credit on the capital account that is roughly equal. And then if you go down here, you see the balance at the bottom here, net lending, borrowing, so on and so forth. It's roughly 123. That amount is the amount that the United States has to borrow from abroad in order to finance its consumption. Okay? So let me sort of clarify that in. The American trade deficit generates a current account deficit, a deficit on the current account. That's like you overspending on your checking account. Okay? Americans are over consuming. They're consuming more than they are earning from their exports abroad. Okay, they're consuming far more. In big trade deficit, they have to get that money from somewhere to meet this condition. And so what they're doing is they're borrowing from abroad. Okay, and you'll see this if you looked at this kind of balance sheet for Canada, and you looked at Canada's international transactions, its balance of payments, it would show much the same thing. If Canada is running a trade deficit, meaning it ends up with a deficit on the current account, country as a whole has to make it up by borrowing from abroad, okay? Well, imagine that this goes on unsustainably. You can play with this, you know, on your own. In the evenings when you're bored, you can bust out a whiteboard and you can play with balance of payments. But this is an interesting sort of discussion to have, because when we think about, let me tackle this topic first. I mentioned yesterday in the email to you about the Chinese, about the Peterson Institute piece on Trump's, phase 1 trade deal with China, that trade, you cannot tackle a trade deficit with trade policy. Because the problem is that the only way you can rebalance this or change this dynamic and prevent the United States in particular from borrowing abroad for the foreseeable future to finance consumption is to change the consumption equation. The United States at some point needs to change this dynamic and turn that into a trade surplus of some kind, change this into a current account surplus, and reduce the amount that it is borrowing from abroad. In fact, becoming a net capital exporter. If you look at Canada's balance of payments over the last, I don't know, the last 6 or 7 years, there have been moments where Canada has run a current account surplus. It runs a pretty sizable trade surplus with the United States, but with the rest of the world included, Canada has been running a reasonably sized current account surplus, meaning that Canada has become an exporter of capital. This equation over short periods of time always has to hold. Current account, capital account equals 0, right? They have to balance each other off. And when they get out of balance, you see a pretty significant rupture, or you see real challenges. Think about the Greek case for just a minute. Go back to this for a second. The Greeks, for a very, very long time, have been importing far more from abroad than they have been earning in terms of exports, okay? The Greeks have been running a significant current account deficit. Well, in order to finance, as a nation, in order to finance that consumption, Greece has had to borrow from abroad. They've had to find some money from somewhere to finance that consumption on the current account. And the challenge for the Greeks is to find people, and we talked about this when we were looking at the debt clock, is to find somebody that's going to do this for them. Find somebody that will lend them money at reasonable rates to help them sort of manage this overconsumption, right? At some point, when you think about, for example, and this comes to maybe a discussion of, no, you know what, I'm going to stop just for a second. I'm going to stop just for a second and see if anybody's got any questions. Let me stop sharing and let me see if anybody's got any questions about that, because that's something, this is something a little different for a bunch of you, and maybe you haven't thought about it in many ways, but it is connected. This set of problems is directly connected to the currency crises that we're going to talk about in, by the way, the extra session on Friday. Did you all get an email from me about that? There's an extra session on Friday. Okay, yeah. So I will be here. You know, if you can make it at 10 o'clock on Friday, great. But all of those currency crises and those financial crises that we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about Mexico, Argentina, what happened in East Asia in the late 1990s. They're all connected to this balance of payments issue, where the countries kind of get a little bit imbalanced in terms of their current account and capital account issues. If you run a current account deficit for too long, and you need to continuously be going to international financial markets to figure out where you're going to get that money to finance that excessive spending, at some point someone's going to cut you off. The other thing that this implies, when you have, look at this, I'm doing this all reverse. When you have, when you're importing more than you're exporting, is you're effectively saying to the rest of the world, you don't want your own currency. Because when you are importing from abroad, right, what you're saying is you're taking your domestic currency, asking for foreign exchange, you're unloading your currency. You're unloading your domestic currency. You're influencing the value of your domestic currency by running this consistent current account or trade deficit. You're saying we don't want domestic currency. We want foreign currency because we want foreign goods. We want to buy foreign goods. We want to be able to import lots and lots of foreign goods. Okay, so you're in a sense saying, yeah, our economy is not producing very much. We want more imports than the things that our economy is producing. But for how long can you sustain this? And going back to that debt clock, some countries can sustain this for much longer than other countries. Okay, and so you think about the difference between the United States, which has a massive current account deficit and has been funding overconsumption through borrowing for a very long time, okay, relative to the Greeks. And so why don't the Greeks have an easy time borrowing, whereas the United States does? Why is it that the Greeks have been cut off, in a sense, right? They've been sort of told, hey, we're not going to lend, no one's going to lend you any more money. Why is it that the Greeks have been cut off and the United States has not, or the Japanese have not? They're also running they're a little different, the Japanese, but why is it? How do we explain some of this divergence. And it's a mix of things, some of which we were talking about last time, with respect to what's the likelihood that that borrowing will be paid back, right? What's the likelihood that the value of the US dollar is going to remain stable, even though you have lots of Americans abandoning it for other currencies because they want foreign goods, okay? So got a question here or two. Oh, okay, well, I've just sort of addressed that. When will the US stop running a current account deficit? That is a $64,000 question, Euro question, I don't know which, but that is a hell of a good question. And I've just admitted that I don't know the answer to that. Nobody does, but people are talking about that in part because the United States is borrowing abroad, not only to finance, well, I mean, if you think about a country's consumption, also in terms of the big budget deficits that are being run, it's not just about trade, right? The United States is borrowing from abroad for all kinds of other things, including the coronavirus relief, okay? And so when the United States borrows abroad for, you know, big fiscal expenditures, for example, all right, you inherently end up with a current account deficit, right? These two things go together. You can't have a surplus or a deficit on both of them. They go together. So as America borrows from abroad to finance coronavirus expenditures, it's inherently making this situation worse, okay? So I mentioned, for example, that trade policy can't really be dealt with to deal with this basic consumption problem. And that's because if you negotiate with the Chinese and you say, okay, we're going to get the Chinese to, you know, buy more stuff from us, that isn't fundamentally going to change this equation with the rest of the world. You can do it with individual countries and maybe, you know, alter your trade balance with an individual country. But the challenge with this is that this is a macro situation here. This is not a bilateral relationship. And so even though the trade deficit with the Chinese is a big deal, the trade deficit with Canada is pretty big too, right? Or with the EU, it's a decent size. So when you add all of that up and you think about that in the context of the entire nation's transactions, trade policy becomes a very difficult tool to change all of this. And if you think about it first from the point of view of the capital account, and you think about the United States borrowing, just inherently borrowing to finance government expenditures and so on, much of it from abroad, you inherently run a current account deficit. You inherently are going to have more consumption than savings. And so you can't fight this with trade policy alone, because you're borrowing from abroad to finance basic government expenditures. Your tax receipts don't nearly get to where you need to be in terms of government expenditures, especially these days, right? And so when you have a capital account surplus, meaning capital is flowing into the country because you're borrowing it, you inherently end up with a current account deficit, meaning you're consuming a lot. And so trade policy is like a drop in the ocean in some ways when you're borrowing bazillions of dollars at a time to finance government expenditures, okay? I think that sort of answered that question. But the idea that Trump can solve America's financial problems by going after the Chinese alone, that's not the problem. The problem is trying to get Americans to consume a little less. And so one of the things connected to how long will America's current account deficit go on is partly connected to Americans' consumption, right? That includes government, right? When will government rein in its fiscal expenditures, reducing the necessity for capital imports, right? To borrow from abroad so that it can fix this, right? So it's a dynamic that's very difficult to break, but you can't do it with trade policy because you're thinking about the nation's consumption as a whole, not just on trade, but also what the United States is borrowing from abroad in order to finance basic consumptions, okay? So I think, let's see if a couple of questions here. I don't know when will they stop? What would examples of foreign investment in the capital account be? We'll talk specifically about foreign investment, foreign direct investment, you know, in, I don't know, maybe not next week, but the week after. super interesting topic because it's connected to international development and split between rich and poor countries. But foreign direct investment can be everything from what they call portfolio flows, meaning foreigners invest in stocks and bonds in the United States or Canada for that matter. Okay, that would be an example of an inflow, right, of capital on the capital account, a portfolio flow. Or if a foreign company, say, big German company like Siemens or Mercedes-Benz or something like that, decides they want to manufacture new stuff in the United States or Canada, then you would also have an inflow of capital to put that manufacturing site on physical land, right? So you can call that brownfield or greenfield investment. So there's capital flows that are portfolio capital flows, but then there are also greenfield investments. And one of the things that we will see some of this next week when we talk about what happened in Asia in the late 90s, is that too much of that capital was portfolio capital, and it exits the country very quickly when this gets out of whack and investors say, oh man, look, this is getting really bad. I want my money, please, so I can get out. And this, what used to be, a positive influx of foreign investment for a developing country, suddenly goes sideways and people exit the country very quickly. They present that domestic currency that they used to have in country, and they say, I want foreign exchange, I want out. And they like a herd of animals, they head for the exits. And it's incredibly destabilizing for the currency and the domestic economy as that portfolio capital exits the country too quickly. So most countries, what they really want is they want that greenfield stuff. They want a physical plant to be brought to bear, because you can't move that. Once you build that, that's a multi-year, multi-decade investment, and that's much more difficult to move, as opposed to this kind of footloose portfolio capital that's invested in paper. It's a capital inflow, but it also can be quickly a capital outflow. And that becomes destabilizing, especially for developing countries that are trying very hard to manage this. So for example, to go back to the Greeks for just a minute, if we imagine this is Greece, right? Maybe they get some foreign investors to come and invest in Greece, and maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a company in Greece you could invest in. I'm not sure what it is. I can't think of a Greek company at the moment. But if the government is perceived as mismanaging its expenditures and borrowing too much from abroad, then those private investors that have been investing capital in paper assets in Greece are going to fold their tents and head for the exits. They'd rather be invested in a different country. And so they'll take their assets, their paper assets, and move them. They're much easier to move and much more destabilizing to move than, say, a physical manufacturing plant, for example. So there are many different kinds of foreign investment, but those end up being either credits or debits on the capital account. The overwhelming majority in any, say a month or week-long period of time of capital flows are portfolio. They're portfolio flows in and out of countries. And as I say, they're, for rich countries, it's not really a big deal. You haven't seen too many examples where rich countries are destabilized by a sudden exit of capital out of the country. But in developing countries, it's particularly problematic, and we'll see how that unfolded when we talk a little bit about some of these actual cases on Friday. But as we talk about those cases, we'll kind of refer back to this, because in those countries that had financial crises in the 90s and through the 2000s, the early 2000s, and Argentina is particularly interesting on this front. Their inability to manage this and manage it in a way that kept capital in Argentina really generated a whole series of cascading series of problems that had them going to the IMF asking for bailouts, loans, renegotiation of existing loans, and has really put the country on a kind of an impoverished track. It should be much wealthier than it is at the moment, but and they look like they're headed for a crisis again, if you read that piece that I sent you. So anyway, very interesting way to sort of talk about this. And this is also a way to talk a little bit about the Sino-US relationship more broadly. And we'll talk about that as well next week. And we'll use this in a way to talk about the cartoon with the dragon on it. Because throw into the mix here some of the differences in exchange rates, exchange rate regimes, meaning the United States has a floating regime, the Chinese have a fixed regime, and that mucks all of this up. And so anyway, it's a very interesting sort of way you can try to depict this, and it's not so easy. My arm hurts now holding this stupid board next to my head. But at any rate, any questions about this? There's been a few here. I think I've tried to answer them all, but there's some notes in an e-class. I can quickly show you all where they are. And I'll quickly show you all where these notes are. All right, so if you go down to week 5, which is kind of where we'll definitely be in week 5 on Friday, okay? If you go down here to week 5, there's some notes here called fix or float, okay? And they do a better job than my little whiteboard can in walking through what the implications are of having, for balance of payments, right? For balance of payments issues, for having a fixed versus floating exchange rate regime, okay? Again, we're getting pretty abstract here with all of this stuff. But these notes actually should animate or augment what we've just been talking about in terms of a country's transactions, international transactions. And what happens, and this would be the punchline for these notes, and maybe I'll send you away with this today and we can revisit some of these things on Friday and next week. But the punchline and the advice that the IMF gave as a result of some of the financial crises that we will talk about is that it's actually better to have a floating exchange rate regime. Why? Well, you can go through these notes here on your own and kind of try to appreciate why, or try to understand a bit of that. But when you have a floating exchange rate regime, what tends to happen is a kind of natural rebalancing. So when you have a long-standing current account deficit and a long-standing trade deficit, remember what that implies about a domestic currency. It means domestic residents are trying to get rid of their domestic currency, right? They're trying to unload it, okay? Well, in a floating exchange rate regime, what happens? Then at some point, you end up, because the domestic currency starts to depreciate in value relative to other currencies, it starts to make exports more expensive. And so the advice when it comes to fix or float is that with a floating exchange rate regime, you eventually see a reversal where imports become too expensive for domestic residents to buy. And so domestic alternatives become more attractive. And whatever the country is exporting also becomes more attractive to foreigners because it looks cheaper. The country's domestic currency has depreciated. To foreigners, that looks like a bargain, okay? And so the argument for a floating exchange rate regime is that you end up with a kind of natural balance in all of this where these dynamics become reversed, right? You don't have to borrow as much money from abroad because you're not consuming as much. You're starting to change the dynamics toward a current account surplus and therefore become a capital exporter, right? Or just at least not borrow as much. And so that's the punchline with having a floating regime. And one of the challenges with the fixed regime, which we'll talk about in the context of the Chinese dragon cartoon, is that you don't have that balance. And we'll see on Friday why that fixed regime becomes very problematic for a country in trying to manage all of this, and often necessitates or brings on a pretty serious financial crisis that basically impoverishes most of the domestic residents. And that's a that's a big source of criticism. When you think about the politics of all of this, criticism of the IMF and the World Bank and how they have, advised countries in terms of all of this, the consequences of a financial crisis really fall most heavily. It's a very regressive situation, and it falls most heavily on those that can't get their capital out of the country, the domestic residents. All of a sudden, they're left holding the bag, and governments are trying to cut budgets, and it's hurting the people that can least afford to manage it. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in the connection of politics, but you'll be able to talk about the politics of all this in the context of the economics at the end of it. It'll be very exciting for all of you if we ever get to sit around and have a beer together again. So, all right, that's the end for today. I'll see all of you again on Friday, or well, most of you, if you can join us, great. Otherwise, have a nice afternoon, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care.